I almost gave up on my life because of chronic fatigue syndrome. There were days where I literally didn't want to wake up. There were days where I just wished my life was completely over because the suffering and the pain was so immense. And there's many reasons why I wanted to give up. And I want to talk about one that hits really deep. It affected my life so much that it delayed my recovery by years. And frankly, the reason why I wanted to give up is because I didn't want to let go of my old life. And at the same time, I couldn't even live my old life. And I was so tied up to that sense of identity of who I was, that because I couldn't be that person anymore, because I couldn't do those things that I was so freaking good at doing and found so easy to do, it literally, that was what created the most pain and suffering. This isolation between who I was and who I wasn't. It was like the carpet had been swept from underneath my feet. I went from just like being super fit, super athletic, running all the time, training in the gym, playing sport all day. I didn't even have to think about anything. Like I was just doing, 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 doing. And then when I got chronic fatigue syndrome, it was like a jolt of just like, boom, no. It was like God saying you're not allowed to do anything. In fact, you're not allowed. You can't. Because I was physically incapable. I went from running all the time to barely being able to lift my head off a pillow, and just the immense pain and suffering that not only came physiologically, like obviously I was exhausted, I had terrible brain fog. The lethargy was huge, like, especially in the acute stage of suffering is what we call it now. But in the acute stage of suffering, I was just exhausted. Like I couldn't do anything. I mean like tie my shoelaces or cook a meal or sit up for a conversation with my mum or my dad or a friend. But if I look back and reflect on that part of my life of having chronic fatigue syndrome, the hardest part, and when I almost gave up on life and when I didn't want to be alive and living anymore because I was barely existing, was the fact that I didn't have my old life back. And it fucking killed me. Almost. Not completely. Almost. It nearly almost killed me. Because I was just so caught up in who I was, to let go of my old self was just so freaking hard. And that's what created the turmoil and the stress and that feeling of giving up. Now, of course, there were days where I just wanted to give up anyway because of the pain, like the actual physiological pain that I was experiencing in my arms, in my legs, in my body. The other thing that was extremely hard was feeling like I was exiled from my friendship group. And that was extremely difficult to deal with because, you kind of know who your people are, you've got your friends, and then all of a sudden you're like the odd one out. Why aren't you at school? Why aren't you playing sport? Why can't you come to the movies? Why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? And at the time, I didn't know at the time what was wrong with me. So I couldn't even explain myself properly. And so there was this constant going back and forth with friends and misunderstandings and hurtful comments, people saying, you're just making this up, or you're just depressed, or you just need to be more motivated. Rumors going around, just not nice things to deal with at any stage of life. But that was a really difficult period of time for me. And I remember just, you kind of feel helpless and hopeless because the people that you love and want to be around the most don't really understand or get you. And so I genuinely just felt like giving up. So I think those three were the biggest things for me. It was the loss of identity. That was the hardest by a mile. Like being so caught up with my identity around being a basketball player, being an athlete, and then not being able to do that was extremely hard. And the second part was the physical actual pain and suffering. You know, I just remember there was days where I would just cry in bed just from the excruciating pain, and I would just, you know, I remember saying to my mum one day, which was just super heavy, I just said, "Mum, I don't want to be here anymore." And it wasn't like that. I was literally profusely crying. It's like, I don't want to be here anymore. And it, you know, it was so hard for my mum to hear that and see that. And it was just a painful damn experience. And then the third one was definitely being exiled from, you know, friendship groups. And that's not to say that all friends were like that, but a majority, not because of their own fault. You know, we say to our clients now that when they're going through this, you know, no one in their family, unless they've been through it themselves, is truly ever going to fully understand what you're feeling and experiencing. And so there's no point trying to convince them or make them understand otherwise, right? Yes, loved ones can support you. Friends can support you. In fact, we have a whole loved ones workshop inside our mentorship program where we help carers and loved ones support their loved one better so that they can recover faster. But those were the three biggest reasons why I wanted to give up, and I'm so grateful I didn't. I'm so grateful I had the support of my family, and I'm so grateful I kept the hope and belief that recovery was possible. And it wasn't until I started to notice it within myself and do all the right things at the right time and get the right support, help, and accountability was I able to start to recognize real physical, tangible progress in my well-being, in my body. And that was the catalyst to obviously get better. I'll put a link in this video of my full story so you can hear my journey and how I completely went from, you know, 4.5 years of suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome to fully better. You know, for the last over 16 years now, I've dedicated my life to helping thousands of people in over 67 countries now get healthy and start living again. And I know how hard it is and the suffering that you're going through. And so I wanted to share in this reflection um, just some real experiences and thoughts, because what you're going through is real. And I think that is, again, one of the hardest things is like, sometimes you just think that you're making it up because people are just saying so much crap on the internet and saying nasty things online. But what you are going through is real. And these experiences of wanting to give up uh, can be so strong, you know, so strong. And I think it's really important to hold hope and belief that it's possible for you to get better. Not because it is, first and foremost, because if you can see an 80-year-old person get better, a 70-year-old person get better, an 8-year-old get better, a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, you know, I've seen so many people from so many different backgrounds with so varying degrees of suffering, you know, and severities of illness, from completely, you know, bedbound, um, not leaving the house for 10 years to, you know, semi-functioning and getting their life back. You know, it's all possible. But I think one of the things that helped me get through that dark time when I felt like giving up was holding on to a better future. But it wasn't until I accepted where I was at that actually enabled me to allow myself to move forwards. Because if you think about it, the biggest chasm for me was the old identity of who I was and who I no longer was. And so I had to accept that in order for that to not be a problem anymore. And it didn't happen overnight. But one of the things that changed me was the day that I accepted my current situation, because I was able to then start to change it. Up until that day, though, like, the suffering was immense, and the internal struggle and that feeling of just wanting to give up was so damn strong until that day when I started to accept my current reality. And I've shared this story before, but I'll share it again just in case you've never heard it. Obviously, at that point, the loss of my identity, who I was, I didn't know my future. I didn't think I'd ever be able to run again. I didn't think I'd be able to ever, you know, be healthy again, because the doctors at that point, you know, this is going over 20 years ago, had no idea what the hell was going on. And I remember just like leaving a doctor's clinic. I was so depressed and in such victim mode. And we call this secondary depression now. Again, when we work with people, they're not depressed because they're depressed. They're depressed because they're dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome. They're depressed because they can't do the things they wish they want to do. And that's a secondary type of depression. And so here I am in secondary depression without even knowing it. My head's down, I've got my hoodie on, and I'm walking down the street to the transport line to get back home from the appointment. And I've got my hoodie on and I'm feeling so sorry for myself and my shoulders are bent over like this and I'm walking down the street like a moping, sad teenage boy. And the thought and the loop pattern that was going on and on and on was, my life is over. I'm never going to get my life back. And as I'm thinking these thoughts, unconsciously, obviously, they're just happening. I'm walking down the street and there's a man in a wheelchair getting pushed behind by his carer. Now, this man had no legs, missing limbs, no legs. You could tell he was severely disabled, couldn't speak, had drool and dribble coming out of his mouth. And as the carer pushed this man towards me, past me in the wheelchair, I remember locking eyes with him. And I remember feeling so sorry for myself in that moment. Like, it was just like, it was like the world revolved around me and my suffering. And I looked at this guy dead in the eyes and he looked straight back at me. And I remember looking down at his legs and not seeing any. And the craziest thing happened. This guy just looked back at me and smiled. Not the carer, the actual disabled man with no legs who was drooling, who it wasn't verbal, smiled at me. And as he went past me, I turned around and looked back. And he looked back over his shoulder on the wheelchair, looked at me again and smiled. And I'll never forget that day. I remember just stopping in my tracks going, holy shit. How dare I? How dare I complain about my life when there's a man who doesn't have a choice that he doesn't have legs, so he cannot ever walk again, right? Doesn't have a choice. And here I'm complaining that my life is over. It was one of the most powerful situations I had ever been in, and ultimately life-changing. I remember just saying to myself, how dare you, Toby? How dare you complain about your situation when this man doesn't even have a choice? At least you've got legs. At least you've got legs and that you can move them. And it was such a contrast, right? Because up until that point, I was like, I can't believe I can't run. Like, I'm not fit anymore. I can't do what I used to be able to do. And then all of a sudden, within a split moment, I'm like, oh my God, I'm just so grateful to have legs. And I remember going home that night for the first time ever in my life, and I pulled out a piece of paper and I wrote down a whole page of what I was grateful for. Like, literally every single thing. And it was just crazy. Of course, the first thing I wrote down was my arms and my legs. Up until that point, it was like everything in my life was missing. And then all of a sudden, that one altercation with this man in a wheelchair flipped my entire perspective on my current situation. And it's funny, that day was the start of my recovery, because I was able to truly be grateful for where I was at, and I could start with where I was at. Whereas before, I was holding on to my old identity so much that I couldn't even comprehend starting with where I was at. And so acceptance isn't resignation, it's a starting point. But before that moment, I thought that accepting my situation was like the worst idea in the world. But after that moment, it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because I was able to start with where I was at and then build from there. And many, many years on, as I got better and eventually recovered, it was my goal to make sure that no one else had to go through what I went through alone. And so at the ripe old age of 19, I decided to start a website called cfshealth.com. And CFS Health didn't stand for chronic fatigue syndrome. It stood for this on this wall instead. I'm in this podcast studio right now. It stood for choice, freedom, success. Because that day when I met that man in the wheelchair, that made me start to choose something different. He didn't have a choice whether he had arms or legs. I had a choice. I had arms and legs. And so realizing that the choices that I made created the future and the freedom that I wanted, and ultimately the success that I could have. But it had to all start from choice, right? It had to start from making a decision for myself in this moment of what is going to help me the most, and then repeating that over and over and over and over and over again and again and again in all areas of life and recovery. And it was a full commitment. It was a full dedication. And, you know, again, it wasn't overnight. There's no quick fix. It wasn't a quick pill. Again, if you want to watch my full story, I'll leave a link in the description or somewhere around here. And I go through in detail kind of like what I went through. But to make the right decisions over time, you have to really focus on where you are right now and where you want to be, not where you were and what you don't have anymore. And that was one of the hardest things. But in reflection, that feeling of giving up is just so, so normal. And I just want to normalize that for you at home. If you're watching this, it's okay if you're having those thoughts. The fastest way to deal with that and combat that is to really just accept your current situation and circumstance so you can change it, and letting go of your old identity. We talk about recovery, and recovery isn't about trying to get back your old life. It's actually building your new life. And when you build your new life and you lean towards more of what you want, your life will start to expand. And in fact, your life can be 10 times better than it was ever before you got sick. And this is what we see with clients all the time. So I just want to share that with you to realize that, there's something bigger waiting for you on the other side of acceptance with where you're at right now, so you can change it. I hope this video helps. If it does, I'd love you to leave a comment. Let me know what your biggest takeaway was and what really resonated with you. Of course, if you're here on our YouTube channel, hit subscribe, hit the like button. I read through every single comment, and it means the world to me that, I and my team can really help you and help anyone in the world, no matter where you're at, change your life, because ultimately that is the ripple effect that will change your life, but your family's life and all the people around you. It'll be a real privilege to be part of. So I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments.